Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, the second major conflict of the Cold War. For the United States, U.S. involvement actually began before 1954, when the United States sent a lot of aid to the French, who were in the Indochina area trying to re-establish their control over French Indochina. French Indochina included the three states of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Now, during the Second World War, Ho Chi Minh and his communist allies had fought very effectively against Japanese occupation. During the Second World War as well, the American OSS provided training and aid during that time. The OSS, for those of you who don't know, is the predecessor to the CIA. When the war ended in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared independence from France. However, as the Cold War became more warm, if you will, the French very much wanted to hold on to their colony, and the United States began to change their attitude, especially under President Eisenhower. The United States went from anti-imperialism to more of a neutral stance, and aggressively anti-rebellion if it was felt that rebellion of the colony was due to communism. So the United States began supplying France with aid to help them in this anti-communist war against the North Vietnamese, or for the Vietnamese period, because the Vietnamese communists were not just in the north, they were in the south, they were also in Laos, they were also in Cambodia. In 1954, things changed for the worst. The French attempted a decisive battle against the Vietnamese communists at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. They took their best troops, French paratroops, put them in a highly fortified position in north and western part of Vietnam in a mountainous region. Their base was in a valley. They believed, wrongly, that the North Vietnamese could not possibly move heavy artillery into those mountains. Well, they were wrong. And Giap, who is the leader of the North Vietnamese, which we'll meet today, brilliantly managed to engineer the movement of this heavy artillery into key positions that had oversight on the French Dien Bien Phu fortifications, and started shelling the devil out of them. The shelling became so severe that the airstrip that provided supplies to the French air base was pockmarked with holes, and soon it became impossible for those aircraft to land, so they started parachuting supplies into the French paratroops. That was literally the beginning of the end. It is so much more difficult to parachute supplies into a position than it is to land and unload. And one of the problems of landing and unloading is the North Vietnamese would shell the aircraft, not just the airfield, the aircraft. And so very soon in 1954, this battle went really bad for the French, and at that point the French just threw up their hands and said to heck with this, and they allowed the United Nations to negotiate an end to the conflict. And part of the negotiations in the United Nations is the United Nations basically wanted free elections throughout this region. French Indochina would be split into three states: Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And these elections would take place. Vietnam Indochina would be split, and elections would take place determining the governments there. But the United States did not like the communist government anymore, even though they had offered them aid during World War II. Ho Chi Minh's government was not favored by the United States, and so the U.S. interfered, and the elections in the Vietnam part of Indochina did not take place. And instead, a civil war erupted in the region between I hate to say pro-democracy, because Diem in the South was hardly a Democrat, but shall we say a pro-American government that became established in South Vietnam, and a pro-communist government under Ho Chi Minh in the North. By 1965, the Southern pro-American government was in big trouble. They basically had failed to effectively gain control over their own territory, let alone the territory in the North controlled by the communists. And it became very evident to the U.S. government, now under John F. Kennedy, that something needed to be done. Since Eisenhower, thousands of American advisors had been sent in. And soon, under Lyndon B. Johnson, who took over for Kennedy after Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Johnson decided to bring in regular troops. That conflict, where the United States was directly involved, lasted until 1972, and the final absorption of southern Vietnam into the North took place in 1975. It is a long, drawn-out conflict. Now let's take a look at these three wars, in this case World War I, World War II, and Korea, and Vietnam. Vietnam is in light blue. And you can see in combat deaths, Vietnam is not one of the highest in combat deaths. World War II is. And World War I is a second to that. And then you have Vietnam, and then finally Korea. And then disease deaths, again, fairly high in World War II. Not surprising, because you have a very large number of American troops serving, far more than in World War I. World War I, you only had about 4 million men serving, and World War II, it was more like 5 times that. And so, again, disease deaths, fairly low. Now let's take a look at World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Small arms, the highest in Vietnam. There's a lot of small arms actions, a lot of search and destroy, a lot of close confrontation with small arms like machine guns, rifles, mortars, pistols, and so on. Typically, small arms means rifles and pistols. Fragmentation, artillery, high explosive, and so on. Actually, less in Vietnam than in World War II or Korea. Booby traps, notice that shoots up way high, a lot higher than the other two wars combined. And then other casualties, and these are suicides, basically, in many cases, suicide or other types of injuries. Now, Ngo Dinh Diem is an interesting character. He had been selected and supported by the United States to represent an anti-communist government. He became president of the Republic of South Vietnam by 1865. But he really, in many ways, had failed to secure the support of the people behind him. He had a very nepotistic rule. What does that mean? It means his family were very much entrenched within his government. His wife, his brother, uncle, nieces, nephews, all occupy key positions within the Vietnamese government, and loyalty to him was more important than competence. So he was appointing family members to jobs that they really weren't, shall we say, capable of doing. They had no background, maybe not even any interest. Many of those who knew them, and like Cabot Lodge, the American ambassador, basically saw him as a Mandarin, an old style Chinese Mandarin, where their family members are basically calling all the shots and everything, regardless of competence. And he has, according to Lodge, he had absolutely no interest in democratic reform. As a matter of fact, Henry Cabot Lodge actually hated Ngo Dinh Diem totally. Now, there is a bit of politics, American politics here, because Cabot Lodge is an ardent Republican, and he comes from a long line of Republican politicians. His predecessor had been a big, powerful member of the Senate during Woodrow Wilson's administration. So there's a lot going on here, but Diem's not interested in democratic reform, even though Kennedy tries again and again to try to encourage him. His government is not in any way representative because Diem is Catholic in a country where 90% of the population is either Buddhist or ancestor worshippers. Only 10% is Catholic. And so he really doesn't have the support of the people, and makes it worse when his wife and his brother purposely persecute the Buddhists, who, are particularly concentrated in the cities of Vietnam, and could have been ardent supporters of his regime. The Buddhists represent about 10%, Catholics 10%, and 80% are roughly ancestor worshippers, according to the latest information on this subject. And so he persecuted the Buddhists. The Buddhists protest, and you can see in the bottom left, there's a Buddhist monk who has doused himself in gasoline right in the middle of this busy intersection in Saigon and lit himself on fire, and is just standing there burning to death. It certainly exhibits his ability to control his pain. He's not screaming out or anything. And because of the persecutions, you have Buddhist riots going on in 1963, and you have Buddhist monks protesting. It's a real first-class mess. But there's one thing you need to know here. Eventually, and this is in 63, eventually, the military of Vietnam, their leadership, will contact the U.S. government and say, we want to get rid of Diem. He's trouble. He's causing all this trouble with the Buddhists. We don't want any trouble. We just want to get rid of him. We want to launch a coup d'etat against him and remove him from power. And Kennedy gives the green flag to this with one provision: don't kill Diem and his family. Well, the coup goes forward, but Diem and his brother escape. They're caught, and you can just practically guess this. They were executed. Now, why do I even talk about this? Another, dictator's gone, who cares? Because while Diem could claim 10% of the population supporting him, none of the generals could claim even that much. And so you have a man who at least 10% of the population supports him, replaced by men who really couldn't garner much in the way of support at all. They're just military dictators, and they rule through terror in many cases, although the last Vietnamese president was not so bad, but he still did not have the backing of the people. At least not as much as he should or needed to have. Ho Chi Minh, of course, I mentioned him. Ho Chi Minh really, in many ways, tried to reach out to the West He was present when the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated. He reached out to the United States. He was rebuffed. Nobody knew him. Nobody cared. But the Soviet Union proved all too willing to help out. And so that encouraged him to move in the direction of communism. But mind you, this is way back in 1918. He cultivated an image of a kindly old man, or Uncle Ho. But one contemporary said he was more like a devil in disguise. He was very ruthless, very shrewd, had no problem executing the opposition in North Vietnam. And that's one way he secured power for himself. And this was a typical communist strategy. You don't work with an opposition, you execute opposition. And this, of course, when you listen to the Korean lecture, remember there were atrocities like that too, where the communists went into these villages, they had lists of people that were to be executed. General Vo Nguyen Giap was a brilliant military leader. I already talked to him in regards to his strategy at Dien Bien Phu on the 13th of March, 1954. 56 days siege, took out the French, defeated their best force. He was a very skilled strategist, understood how he could fight and survive against the superior power of the United States. His strategy was simple. You advance, we retreat. You withdraw, we advance. And therefore, this strategy effectively defeated General Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy. Because as soon as the Americans would go in, they'd destroy the enemy, but in fact they would only fight them to the point the enemy decided to withdraw. And then once the Americans left, his troops just came right back in and occupied the area. So if you're talking about a war more like World War II, in that you occupy regions and areas and control them, then Giap was fighting that kind of war. But the Americans were fighting a war of attrition. And I'll get into that more later. But this strategy worked. Now, Lyndon Johnson had been vice president under Kennedy, and of course he'd been assassinated and took over for him and served out the rest of his term, and then ran for president in the November 1964 election in his own right. He had actually run against Kennedy in the Hillary presidential election, but had lost the nomination of his party. So, like all politicians, they look for an opportunity to demonstrate your presidential determination. And in the case of the Gulf of Tonkin, that happened in August 1964, just prior to the November election, mind you, he demonstrated his desire to use force if necessary against the Vietnamese communists. Vietnamese communists attacked an American destroyer. That destroyer actually had bullet holes in it, so there was physical evidence of an attack, and a warning was given to North Vietnam. Then a second attack took place. There was no physical evidence of this attack, and now historians believe that it was a mistaken misinterpretation of radar signals during a storm, and the attack supposedly took place at night during a storm. They had no visual sighting of the enemy except through radar. And it is believed that the radar gave incorrect information to the controlling sailor, and he reported incorrectly that they were under attack. They weren't under attack. But nevertheless, the president reacted, and he sent in the troops. In 1964, started sending in the troops to help the South Vietnamese out, because quite frankly they were losing this war. He as vice president had gone there and basically told Kennedy, we don't want to get involved in this pissant little country. Well, he's involved now. What he really wants is the Great Society programs. He wants to push these domestic programs like Medicare, like student loans, various programs to help Americans better their lives. In March 1965, the U.S. Air Force and Navy began the Rolling Thunder campaign. And this was very much supported by the president because guess what? President Johnson wanted this pissant little war, to paraphrase him, over with as soon as possible. And he saw the bombing campaign of Rolling Thunder as a way to bring the pain home to the Vietnamese to get them to lay off of South Vietnam. That was what he was looking for, get them to back off and come to the peace table. However, he also Americanized the conflict. He effectively brought in U.S. troops, and those U.S. troops more and more began to replace the South Vietnamese at the front line because, quite frankly, the opinion of the U.S. military, and they're not far off, is the South Vietnamese can't win against the Vietnamese communists. They need better equipment, better training, and so on. So the idea is bring in the Americans. Maybe they can bring this war to a quicker end than trying to depend on the Vietnamese of the South Vietnamese government army. So we have a bombing campaign that unfortunately is subjected to multiple cases of presidential interference, to the point where the bombing campaign is more of a joke. Now, I guarantee you Johnson didn't see it that way. Johnson had an inherent distrust of Army officers or Air Force officers and so on. And this is understandable. He had been vice president during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so he's had somewhat of a jaded view of military experts. Rolling Thunder would be initiated between the 2nd of March 1965 through 68, and it would end around the time of the TET Offensive. Everything involved during this campaign was a picked target, carefully picked, oftentimes by the President of the United States. The Air Force and the Navy would provide a list of targets, and the President would pick and choose. Well, this is a bit too much micromanagement of the air war. There is no overall strategy of let's hit them in this particular economic sector to support what we're doing on the ground. There is no coordination between the air campaign and the ground campaign. There is a ban on bombing Hanoi, the North Vietnamese capital, or Haiphong, the main port of entry into North Vietnam. Now, you would think both would be critical in forcing the Vietnamese to the peace table, especially the bombing of Haiphong. And the reason why it was banned, by the way, in the case of Haiphong, is there was concern that Russian or Chinese ships might be sunk in that bombing. Well, so be it. Just tell them, you send supplies that way, you're running the risk of your ships being sunk. You could take a tough line, but there was worry that, just like in Korea, that the war might suddenly widen. If we sink Chinese and Russian ships, they might get upset at us, and it might ramp up the war or broaden it. There was also a ban on bombing near the Chinese border for exactly the same reason. The Chinese are moving supplies over the border to supply the North Vietnamese. There's no doubt about that, but we don't want to bomb accidentally across the Chinese border. They might get mad at us. Again, the concern of widening the conflict. There was also a ban on counter-sanctuary operations, which, from my perspective as a military historian, absolutely puzzles me. Because where were these sanctuaries? They were in Laos and Cambodia. At one time, they had been part of the colonial possession of the French called French Indochina. So, and the fact that the Ho Chi Minh Trail went from North Vietnam through Laos into Cambodia and into the southernmost part of South Vietnam, which is largely swamp. So this is a problem. Your enemy now is able to move supplies, and yes, they did, and establish bases, and yes, they did, across the border, knowing full well the stupid Americans are not going to attack them. All right? Now, that doesn't mean the Americans are stupid. Matter of fact, I guarantee you, every American officer in Vietnam, of general rank or higher, wanted to send in the bombers to hit those bases. But the president is forbidding them because they're worried it might broaden the conflict. Guess what? The moment the Vietnamese moved into Laos and Cambodia, the conflict was already widened. Another problem with Rolling Thunder is gradualism. They go so slow in this campaign. The name of the campaign does not indicate the intensity of it. They would bomb 1 week, just one target, and then wait and see what the reaction was. No reaction? Okay, we'll bomb another target. But in other words, this is nothing like what was experienced during World War II in Europe, where literally, or Japan for that matter, where literally day and night cities were being bombed, targets were being bombed. It was not. Yes, a lot of bombs were dropped in Vietnam. Matter of fact, if you take the whole war, more bombs were dropped in Vietnam than in World War II. But guess what? It was so spread out, because remember, Vietnam was not 4 years long. All right? It was not 4 years. It was from 65 to 72, and that's the American portion of it. All right? So, of course there are going to be more bombs, is what I'm saying. But this gradual approach allowed the enemy to recover between bombings, allowed the enemy to establish an ever stronger anti-aircraft presence in the north, courtesy of the Soviet Union. Our anti-aircraft artillery is provided, SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, are provided, and it becomes very difficult to bomb North Vietnam. We lose a lot of aircraft, we lose a lot of pilots, and for not much gain, because instead of hitting a target and destroying it, we hit a target and move on. And then later on, maybe that target's totally recovered, but we don't hit it again until much, much later. So there's no pain in this process, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Another individual that influenced the way the war was fought in a bad way was Robert Strange McNamara, Defense Secretary under LBJ, and he had been Defense Secretary under Kennedy as well, a graduate of Harvard Business School. He had been CEO of the Ford car manufacturing company in 1960, and he felt that the best way to win the war is through business analysis, fighting by the numbers. And he wanted what each American unit in Vietnam, how many people have you killed today? And they'd crunch it under their numbers and everything. And then he goad different officers if he felt they weren't killing enough. Now, the problem with fighting by the numbers is the numbers you get are not 100% accurate when you have an enemy who drags their dead and wounded away. So you're only guessing how many casualties you really caused. Furthermore, McNamara came up with this brilliant idea of a strong defensive line along this narrow border between North and South Vietnam. It was like the Maginot Line of 1940 France, except in this case it's called the McNamara Line. And this is all across the 17th parallel. Well, the reality is that the enemy just goes around it. They don't have to go through it. They just go around this defensive line, because it ends once the common border between North and South ends. General William C. Westmoreland, command of MAC V from 64 to 68, MACV stands for Military Assistance Command Vietnam. He decides to fight the war on attrition. This is a very different strategy from that of World War II. In attrition, you find the enemy, you fix them in place, and you destroy them, and then you go back to your base. And then you go out again. You sortie out again, find, fix, destroy, and then go back to base. Now, the reality is you're not really destroying the enemy, although he perceived it that way. What you're really doing is bloodying the enemy, and they just simply disappear in the jungle and you lose track of them. So you're considered to have destroyed them. Well, you didn't. They just decided to leave. And that's always the problem in Vietnam. When you're fighting battles, the enemy pretty much calls the shots of when the action ends. So he initiated this strategy of attrition, very different from World War II. In World War II, we moved into a region, we gained control of that region, and then moved on to the next region, and so on and so forth. So there's no guerrilla warfare in this case because you're moving into the region, eliminating the enemy completely before you move on to the next one, and you retain control. In attrition, there's no reason to retain control. So you attack, destroy, pull out. Attack, destroy, pull out. And these are called search and destroy missions. Westmoreland did initiate big battles. For example, when he cleared out the Iron Triangle. Although, what he discovered is he couldn't clear out the Iron Triangle because the enemy had multiple underground complexes in the region. So he may have thought he cleared it out, but the reality is, with all those underground facilities, there's no way to be certain you have cleared it all out. And so a lot of times when American units are going through the Iron Triangle, they think they've cleared out an area, and suddenly they get sniper fire from an area they just supposedly cleared, because there are all sorts of underground complexes that the Viet Cong hide in. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the JCS, estimated that to win in Vietnam, they needed 1 million men. Well, Johnson was unwilling to draft that many young men into this war. It would have meant a more aggressive crackdown on the deferment plan that was in place. They allowed people who were going to college to defer. People well known in our history, Clinton for one, avoided the draft through an education deferment. George Bush Jr., the younger George Bush, avoided the draft by joining the Texas National Guard, although apparently his attendance there was kind of iffy. Sylvester Stallone apparently got an education in Europe to avoid the draft. So a lot of famous personages who were young men at this time could very well avoid the draft if they had the connections and the money. And that was true for all three of these gentlemen. It doesn't mean they're bad people, it just means they avoided the draft. So the president was unwilling to raise the number of American troops in Vietnam to 1 million. Now, why would 1 million be needed? Well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff based their estimate on studies, because it's not just search and destroy. You have to control areas, and you need a lot of troops to occupy these regions and keep them secure. But we never had that 1 million men to secure the region. So we could only, and maybe this is, I blame Westmoreland a lot for the failure of U.S. strategy, but maybe he felt this was the only strategy capable, given the fact that he never had, at best he had 50% of what the JCS recommended. He didn't have the personnel to control a region. Or so he might believe. Well, maybe that's true with American troops, but he also had South Vietnamese troops. They could help out. Okay, so the attrition strategy is an unhealthy strategy for the United States. The American people are going to be puzzled by it. They're going to be wondering, why Are we retaking the same region over and over again? And what's the point if we can't hold on to anything? But it wasn't that. It was a attrition strategy of find, fix, destroy, go back to base. Another problem is this decision to limit tours of duty of officers in order to increase the experienced number of officers in the U.S. military. So he wanted to take advantage of the war to give American officers experience in combat. That is an understandable and laudable objective, but he did it by rotating the officers out every 6 months and the enlisted men every 12. And that is a problem. Now, think of it for a moment. You're a soldier. You go to Vietnam. You're under your commanding officers, lieutenants, captains, majors, colonels, and everybody's getting to know how you fight in Vietnam. 6 months in, the officers you trust that you have learned the art of war in Vietnam with are gone and are replaced with green officers who have served elsewhere in the Army during this time period, don't have the combat experience, may even be fresh cadets right out of West Point. This is ridiculous. They don't know how to fight. They're not necessarily listening. If they're smart, they listen to their unenlisted officers, who, by the way, weren't transferred out, and they are staying right along with the unenlisted soldiers. So the enlisted, unenlisted, the sergeants and the corporals, they stay right along with the men, while the lieutenants and above serve only 6 months. This inconsistency of command is bad for morale. It creates an environment of distrust between the soldiers and those who are commanding them, and effectively led to fragging. What's fragging? Well, you and the men in your platoon have this lieutenant. He's as green as they come. He's making stupid mistakes. And when the sergeant tries to basically tell them, sir, it's better to do it this way, the other way we get in trouble, and he basically ignores the sergeant's advice and does whatever he pleases and men get killed, you're pissed. You don't want this greenhorn commanding your platoon anymore. So the best thing is to frag him. So what's fragging? Well, you wait for the green lieutenant to go into his tent, maybe for the night, roll a grenade in, boom, problem solved. He gets injured, he's sent home with a Purple Heart, and you don't have to deal with him anymore, and your sergeant is now commanding the platoon. And the primary reason why they did this isn't out of disloyalty to the commanding officer or anything. The problem is they're worried this commanding officer is going to get them killed. And if men believe that, well, they're not going to sit around and wait. They don't like officers who do not have them in mind. So this is a decline in morale due to command, the constant rotation of command, and also because of the seemingly pointless search and destroy missions. There's one hill in Vietnam called Hamburger Hill. There are 2 major attacks on Hamburger Hill. Both times we take it, both times we leave. What's the point of fighting in a war if you don't hold on to something you've spilt blood over? The Viet Cong, which were the Vietnamese communist guerrillas in South Vietnam, are superb excavators. Notice the tunnel in the bottom left, the cleverly camouflaged trap door. They have huge underground complexes within miles of Saigon, miles of tunnels. This tunnel network includes ammunition depots, armories, medical facilities, even operating rooms, you name it. They also have booby traps around the entrance. They use punji sticks as well, booby traps to kill or maim Americans. In many cases, it wasn't so much to kill, but to maim, because they knew that for every one they maim and injure, 2 more will be required to take the injured man to the rear, to medical facilities. So it was actually in your interest to maim rather than kill with these booby traps. One of the little ploys they used were punji sticks. And you can see that in the upper right. These are bamboo sticks that are sharpened at one end. Now, the Americans used punji sticks too, but there was one key difference. Vietnamese or Viet Cong punji sticks had human fecal matter on the spikes. So when that punji stick went through your boot or into your leg, the reality is you not only have a wound, but a guaranteed infection. And that the whole purpose is to incapacitate, if possible. The TET Offensive of 1968 was the major turning point of Vietnam. It is a surprise attack organized by Giap, or I should say Giap. It's Giap. And Giap did a beautiful job. It was reasonably well coordinated, although because of time differences between the North and the South, there was a 1-day lag in some of the attacks. Nevertheless, that's pretty good coordination. And this surprise attack occurred during a traditional New Year's holiday, TET, that ever since the beginning of the Civil War between the two sides had been honored as a non-combat time period. The Viet Cong were co-participated with the NVA, which is the Northern Vietnam Army, and they coordinated in their attacks. The Viet Cong actually had a special commando team that managed to break into the U.S. Embassy grounds. They blew a hole through the U.S. Embassy wall, killed 2 Marine guards, and so on. They didn't take over the embassy, but they did attack it. Very humiliating for the United States when their commander, Westmoreland, is telling everybody in the U.S. that Saigon's secure. It's under our control. He's also telling Americans that we see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're coming near the end of the war. It's only a matter of time. The enemy's on their knees. They're about to be defeated. And then suddenly they launch this massive, coordinated assault on southern Vietnam. And I mean massively coordinated assault. Every town, village, and city and military base were attacked by the Vietnamese communists. Everyone. From the ancient capital of Hue, spelled H-U-E but pronounced Hue, to the major city of South Vietnam, Saigon, plus various facilities, the MAC-V compound, Military Assistance Vietnam compound, also the General Staff compound of the South Vietnamese Army. They hit everything. Huge fighting. The biggest battle of the war was fought at Hue during the TET Offensive. All right, so if you're an American citizen at home watching the news and you're being told days before the TET Offensive that the war is coming to an end, it's only a matter of time, and suddenly the enemy that's supposedly on its knees and begging for mercy is launching a massive assault, not just in one place, but throughout South Vietnam, you're going to begin doubting this general's word. And this actually, what made TET interesting is that the U.S. won this battle against the Vietnamese in this offensive. They defeated the Vietnamese communists everywhere. Everywhere they struck, they were defeated. And it was huge in manpower losses for the North Vietnamese. Huge. Viet Cong lost a lot of personnel. North Vietnamese Army lost a lot of men. It was a very costly failure. And yet, TET, even though it's a failure, will be a success, a strategic success. Why? Because Westmoreland looks like a liar. The President of the United States looks like a liar. McNamara looks like a liar. They all look like a bunch of bumbling incompetents who have screwed up. And the opposition Republican Party, with Nixon running for the presidency, will point that out over and over again. With all this blood and treasure, Nixon will go on to say, we have no progress. Well, I'm going to do something about that. And that's how Nixon wins the election, basically laying out the failure of U.S. military diplomatic policy in Vietnam. It's a total flop. So, with the end of the TET Offensive, we win, but the President of the United States, Johnson, says, I'm not going to run for re-election, even though he could have, where McNamara resigns and Westmoreland is gotten rid of. So we have a changeover in leadership after TET. That's what makes it an important turning point for the war. Another thing is kind of the shocking revelations, shocking to the American psyche of fair play. And let's face it, the news reporters play on this. The news reporters are somewhat shocked that war is so uncivilized. For example, during the Viet Cong attack on Saigon, during the TET Offensive, National Police General Nguyen shot outright, with no trial, nothing, a captured VC captain, Nguyen Van Lim, who was accused of killing 30 civilians of police families. Now, to the news reporters reporting this is shocking. He deserves a trial. All right, let's put it in perspective of Lone, although admittedly he was probably drunk when he did this, because according to one source at least, Lone was notorious for having a six-pack of beer with him wherever he went in his Jeep. But let's just say he was sober for the moment, and alcohol did not play a role in this decision. When the TET Offensive occurred, no one could be certain they were going to win against the Vietnamese communists. They were attacking everywhere. It was total chaos. And they caught this guy. There's a chance that we may never get a chance to try him if we lose. And what he had done was so outrageous, even by our standards, that shooting was far easier than putting him on trial. I mean, let's face it. This is not the United States. This could be considered a war crime. But under the desperation of the time period, the fact that the Viet Cong are attacking everywhere, that we don't know if we're going to win, well, I'd say Lone would argue, I had no way of knowing that we would even have time to try this person for crimes. But this shocked America, and that's my point. American sensibilities were shocked by this kind of outright brutality. But then, that's what civil wars are. They're horribly, horribly brutal. Vietnamese killing Vietnamese. After TET, we get a breakdown in the American military. We have an incident called My Lai, where upwards of 400 civilians are killed by U.S. troops, namely a platoon of U.S. troops, platoon is roughly around 40 men, led by Lieutenant William Calley. And even though his commanding officer was circling overhead in a helicopter, Captain Ernest Medina, he did nothing to interfere with what many later construed as an illegal order to murder these people. Now, to be fair to Calley, his platoon had come under attack, had suffered some casualties due to booby traps, but also come under attack prior to entering My Lai. They had been told that the people in My Lai were potentially Viet Cong. So in that regard, they came in ready to kill anything. Later on, Calley will be tried for murder. He will be convicted of murder, but later on will be released after serving some time, because there's a realization that really what he is being is a scapegoat for, quite frankly, an unwritten U.S. policy of U.S. units going in and just shooting up civilians because they might be Viet Cong. Another thing we see is an increased fragging episodes as Westmoreland's cycle of switching people in and out, officers in and out of Vietnam every 6 months, has a deleterious effect on morale. Further, shall we say, examples of a morale decline is proliferation of drugs. In 1971, more men are being treated for drug abuse in the Army than casualties in Vietnam. You have 5,000 casualties. Now, with all this going on and all this happening, the reality is that a new president is going to come in and a new military leader that if they had been in place in the very start of Vietnam, the war might have ended differently. On the military side, we have Creighton W. Abrams, a highly aggressive, World War II armored commander who has a very different approach to Vietnam. He comes up with a different strategy called a one war strategy, which is actually a comment that there seem to be two different kinds of wars going on in Vietnam, the ground war and the air war. Now we're going to have one war where both are coordinated with each other. He also came to the conclusion that the biggest problem in South Vietnam was the fact that there had been an underground parallel government throughout South Vietnam. Every village had two mayors, the communist mayor and the mayor that owes their allegiance to the South Vietnamese government. And you had parallel tax collectors, parallel draft officers, and so basically if you were in a village, there were representatives of the communist government in the village and representatives of the South Vietnamese government in the village. These parallel governments meant that South Vietnamese government never really controlled much of South Vietnam because of these parallel governments. Well, Operation Phoenix ends this. It ends it effectively ends this parallel government, and now only South Vietnamese government is left. So they arrest these people, they try them, they execute them, and so on. It's very controversial, Operation Phoenix, because there are some people who are outright executed for committing treason. And people are shocked by this, or at least the news reporters are shocked by this. But let me talk about the propaganda of the North Vietnamese, who talk about assassination, these assassination of these innocent people and so on. That's just pure rubbish. Now, He also initiates the Hearts and Minds campaign that the Marines had said needed to be done all along. And this is what the Marines have been doing in the North Highlands part of Vietnam. You have to win the hearts and minds of the people. You have to do things for the people that make them look favorably on you, like provide medical care to injured people, to children, vaccinations, hospitals, stuff like that. Abrams also limited search and destroy missions here on out. He decided that enough was enough, and he had no problem now attacking sanctuaries in Cambodia and in Laos. He had no problem with sending troops over there to attack these enemy bases and to bomb them. And he's facilitated in that by the new president, who we'll meet in a second. So this is what the Phoenix program did. You have 17,000 granted amnesty, 28,000 captured, 20,000 executed. Now, as I said, many of the news reporters decried the brutality of this program. But after TET, bleeding the Viet Cong white, and then the Phoenix program, it virtually destroyed the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. There just wasn't much left of them. Why do I say that? Well, because in 1975, when the North Vietnamese began their final campaign to take over South Vietnam, the Viet Cong were virtually invisible. There were very few of them left. So they weren't able, they didn't have the numbers anymore. They had been destroyed effectively between TET and Operation Phoenix. Now compare the 20,000 killed to the 61,000 killed through assassination by the North Vietnamese. Yeah, there's a bit of a problem there, isn't it? And this is, I'm not against news reporters, but their biggest problem is when they report the news, a lot of times they're short-sighted. They didn't take a look at, well, how many people had been killed by the North Vietnamese. 20,000? Not so bad. It's 1/3 of what the North Vietnamese had done. Now, the president, of course, elected in 1970, and actually 1968 election, Richard Nixon will give the military the necessary permission to go after the North Vietnamese in a big way. Why? Because by doing so, Nixon believes he can force them to the peace table. So all gloves are off now. He initiates the linebacker bombing campaign. And there are no more limits. Haiphong Harbor bombed. Haiphong Harbor mined, actually, as well. North Vietnam, Hanoi, bombed. Sanctuaries across the border, bombed. He initiated the menu bombings. These were aimed specifically at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Laos, and Cambodia, and all those bases in those regions. He's bombing them. Now, there would be those in the media, as well as the U.S. civilian population, who will decry these menu bombings as spreading the war beyond the borders of Vietnam. That is pure rubbish. The war had already spread beyond the borders of Vietnam. Now the United States is actually attacking those sanctuaries and really hurting the North Vietnamese efforts against South Vietnam. And those bombings and those military campaigns on the ground will, in fact, force the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table in a very serious way as never before. And the man who helped broker that peace with honor that that Nixon is after, is none other than Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State. And peace with honor is essential for Nixon. Now, one other thing he does, because Nixon wants to remove Americans from the front line more and more as time goes on, is Vietnamization. And Vietnamization meant that Vietnamese, if they're going to be maintaining equipment and everything, reading American tech manuals, they needed a crash course in English. And so that's part of Vietnamization. Vietnamization is putting Vietnamese troops in the front lines for American troops, basically substituting them in now. And let's face it, they've had plenty of time to train and equip themselves. They should be able to fight at the front line right along with the Americans. There's one problem, though. They have incompetent leadership. But that's another story. But part of Lincoln... I don't know why I keep on doing this. Part of Nixon's agenda is to get the Americans out. And you don't get the Americans out by having American troops being the only ones really doing most of the fighting. So he begins to insert the Vietnamese troops into the front lines, and this begins to change the dynamics of the war. Now, the last president of Vietnam was Nguyen Van Thieu. And if you haven't guessed it already, he's a military officer, general officer. He was one of the last military men to initiate a coup d'etat against yet another previous Vietnamese general. He runs a very corrupt regime, no change there. They've all been corrupt. Even Diem's, Ngo Dinh Diem, his regime was corrupt, but at least it had some support of the people. In 1967, there was an election. He ran for president, and he only got 38% of the vote. Now, I tell you, from the perspective of dictators, that's pretty poor performance. And Thieu, even though in some ways he was maybe a nicer man than his predecessors, he was not a very good dictator and not a really good Democrat either. Saddam Hussein, for example, had nearly 100% of the vote behind him when he had an election just before Desert Storm. So, what can I say? Didn't really have the backing of the people. Congress began, once Nixon's out of the picture, Congress begins cutting aid to South Vietnam. And South Vietnam's whole economy has been based on the presence of American troops and on American aid. And once those begin to dry up, the South Vietnamese economy tanks. Thieu followed the same strategy as his predecessors, political patronage over professional competence. So you would have lower level officers of lieutenants, captains, colonels, and so on that were very competent men, very capable officers, but the general commanding them is an incompetent boob because political loyalty is more important than competence. So you had competent officers who wouldn't be promoted even though they merited it, and only people who were corrupt, if you will, or loyal to the regime above all else, regardless of competence, would be promoted. And this rot within the command structure of the South Vietnamese army is an important reason why South Vietnam fell so fast after the Americans were fully withdrawn in 1972. South Vietnam will fall in 1975. It all began innocently enough when the North Vietnamese launched an attack in the northern part of Vietnam called the Central Highlands. This is a very mountainous, tropical jungle region, and they just were trying to not overly upset the United States. They were going to basically take South Vietnam in little chunks. So the first attempt to do this was in the northern highlands of South Vietnam. And they're so successful, and the South Vietnamese army collapses totally. I mean, literally, formations just literally disintegrate, and instead of an organized South Vietnamese army trying to hold back the enemy and doing a fighting withdrawal out of the Central Highlands after President Tu ordered them to withdraw, it's just a mob. It's just a mob, and not protecting anybody. If anything, they're shooting their own people. They're shooting their own civilians. It's really, really bad. And so it becomes very evident that the United States has no choice but to evacuate what remaining personnel they have, plus any Vietnamese who feel threatened by the communists, who are, quite frankly, closing in for the kill. They had been so successful in the Central Highlands that now the North Vietnamese are coming south and they're closing in on Saigon. And there's not much to stop them. And so the United States began evacuating those Vietnamese they felt were worthy, people who had been loyal to them, translators and so on, plus their own personnel. And it is largely handled by Marines who are guarding the American embassy and other nearby buildings that are used to evacuate people from South Vietnam. The 30th of April, with the last of the personnel being literally, there's a huge mob outside the U.S. Embassy, people, all these people trying to get in, Marines holding them back. Finally, the last Marines are evacuated just after the last group of people were evacuated. There was almost case, this is the ironic twist here, of a small unit of Marines that had been left behind, and they forgot about them, and then suddenly someone remembered, oh my gosh, there's still a contingent of Marines there, we better go in and get them. And one of the Marines later on in an interview related, we were on the top of the embassy watching them get closer and closer, the communist Vietnamese, and they're getting closer. We hear the tanks. We see the tanks. They're getting closer and closer to the U.S. Embassy. Where are the helicopters? And finally, one helicopter came in and pulled them out. They were only a squad of men, about 10 men. The cost of the Vietnam War is considerable. In blood and treasure, 150 billion. U.S. casualties, 375,000. South Vietnamese, high casualties. North Vietnam pays the highest price, 1.1 million. Of course, the civilians who get caught in the crossfire in the North and the South, 2 million people. So, the Vietnam War results in the U.S. military developing something called the Powell Doctrine. The Powell Doctrine's job, and this is a doctrine embraced by the U.S. military in its entirety, is they want to avoid unfocused conflicts in the future like this that seem to have no actual defined objectives, no real goals to work towards to bring the war to an end. That's the purpose of the Powell Doctrine, to avoid another Vietnam. Because nobody ever really had solidified objectives in the Vietnam War. Okay, if we meet these, we can leave. These endless wars. That's what they want to prevent. So first and foremost, is the region being fought over vital to U.S. interests? Well, in the case of Vietnam, the answer would be no. Is there a real intention to win this war? The answer is no. Clearly defined military and political objectives. There weren't any in Vietnam, and that's one reason why it was an endless war. We got involved kind of by accident. We kind of had some nebulous objectives. Well, we kind of like the South Vietnamese government to be able to stand on its own 2 feet and anything, but how do you achieve that objective? That was never really defined. And that's what they mean by clearly defined military and political objectives. Ends and means reevaluated. Nobody ever sat back in Vietnam and said, you know what, do we really have enough troops there? Do we have enough resources? What do we need to change? Do we maybe have too much here or not enough there or whatever? And that's important in war. When the war doesn't seem to come to an end, you need to sit back and say, okay, what are we doing wrong so we can bring this baby to an end quick? Because you don't want endless wars. They're costly in not only treasure but in lives. Also, another one is the full support of the government and the American people. Soldiers found themselves fighting in Vietnam and being not supported back home, either by the government or by the people themselves, demonstrating in the streets and everything. And the commitment of the U.S. military is a last resort. In other words, if there's another way of achieving this goal, let's do that. Let's not commit U.S. troops to an area of questionable worth. Let's make this the last resort. And finally, a clear exit strategy. And what that is we meet these objectives, and once those objectives are fully met, like stability of the government, an effective government military of the government we support and everything, then we leave. And then all right, A, B, and C are achieved, now we're leaving. And that's what they mean by a clear exit strategy. And this is the legacy of the Vietnam War. Even though this doctrine has not been fully followed, it still exists, and the military want to embrace it as much as possible. And we'll actually revisit this again when we talk about Desert Storm.